The second Dan Bongino deposited that slender, unmarked file onto the witness table, the entire atmosphere of the hearing underwent a seismic shift. The press corps couldn't immediately pinpoint the change, and the committee members remained equally oblivious. Yet, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sensed the disturbance, feeling her confidence flicker for the first time that morning. Inside that folder lay every piece of evidence she never anticipated entering the room. Untraceable campaign funds, shell entities connected to her chief of staff, dead-end transactions, and the glaring contradictions between her affluent lifestyle and her public crusades. It contained the devastating economic fallout from the Amazon HQ2 rejection and a single historical comparison that would eventually stun the proceedings into absolute silence. When Bongino finally opened that dossier, the theater ended, and for the first time in her tenure, AOC found herself without a single line left to recite. What transpired next was one of the most catastrophic political implosions Congress had ever witnessed, and the fatal blow did not arrive through shouting, but through a question she could not address. Across the chamber, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez assumed her position with the bravado of someone who considered the cameras mere extensions of her own willpower. She rifled through her notes with crisp, assertive movements, whispering to her aide, "Get ready, because this one is going viral." Her aide nodded in agreement, confirming, "They are already prepping the clips for social media." AOC smirked with satisfaction, replying, "Good, let's give them something clean to work with." The energy in the room pivoted when Dan Bongino entered, not with fanfare or drama, but with a steady gait that caused several heads to turn. He wasn't flanked by an entourage, nor did he carry a towering stack of documents. He simply walked to the table, took his seat, and placed a thin, unmarked folder before him. AOC noticed it instantly, muttering, "What is that?" while narrowing her eyes in suspicion. Her aide shrugged it off, suggesting, "Probably nothing, just a prop." However, Bongino rested his fingertips on the cover with the composure of someone handling something far heavier than paper. A committee member leaned forward to ask, "Mr. Bongino, are you ready to proceed?" Bongino nodded once, affirming, "Been ready." Reporters exchanged puzzled glances as AOC cleared her throat loudly, projecting across the table. "I hope you brought something substantial." Bongino looked up, his expression entirely placid, and replied, "I brought enough." When another member asked what the folder contained, Bongino answered simply, "Just answers?" AOC scoffed under her breath, whispering, "Cute," but Bongino refused to take the bait. He simply kept one hand resting on the file as if he were holding a gate shut against a flood. AOC leaned back in her chair, and her aide whispered, "If he thinks that is going to intimidate me, it won't. Stick to the plan." She nodded, confirming, "Oh, I will." On the opposite side of the table, a staffer near Bongino whispered, "They are expecting a confrontation." Bongino did not break his gaze from AOC, stating, "They will get something else." The committee chair raised the gavel, announcing, "This hearing will come to order." A hush descended over the room, cameras locked into focus, and everyone waited for the first strike, expecting it to come from AOC's side. Yet the real story, the narrative no one yet comprehended, was already sitting in front of them, bound in a silent, unmarked folder that seemed to thicken the air around it. Bongino tapped it once with his index finger, almost gently, whispering a barely audible, "This is where everything changes." The gavel struck once, sharp enough to slice through the room's palpable anticipation. The chair announced, "Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you have 5 minutes." AOC inhaled deeply, like a performer stepping into a spotlight, and declared, "5 minutes is more than enough," loud enough for the microphones to capture. She didn't ask a question, but instead launched into a statement. Deputy Director Bongino, your presence here today raises serious concerns about the integrity of federal law enforcement. Her words fired out in rapid, practiced bursts, polished and crafted for the specific camera angles she knew were trained on her. Your lack of qualifications, your public partisanship, and your history of inflammatory rhetoric are not the traits of someone fit for such a role. Bongino sat motionless, hands folded lightly over the folder, not blinking once. AOC pressed her advantage, stating, "Your resume reflects stagnation, not service. Your commentary reflects bias, not objectivity. And frankly, your appointment represents everything Americans fear about corruption inside the Bureau." Behind her, a Democratic member murmured, "She is going for the clip." Another nodded in agreement, whispering, "She will get it." AOC pivoted slightly, a subtle and practiced motion to angle herself toward the cameras, asking, "Tell me, Mr. Bongino, how does a man with your record expect the American people to take him seriously?" When there was still no reaction, she leaned in closer, demanding, "Answer that." The pause stretched, reporters lifted their pens, staffers shifted in their seats, and AOC's team glanced at each other with smug anticipation. Finally, Bongino spoke, asking simply, "You done?" Gasps fluttered across the room, and AOC blinked, thrown off balance for a split second, hoping no one had noticed. "I asked you a direct question," she snapped back, trying to regain the offensive. "No," Bongino said calmly. "You delivered a monologue, a passionate one with a lot of adjectives, but very light on facts." AOC's jaw tightened as she asked, "Are you refusing to answer?" Bongino's voice was steady, softened by a trace of amusement, as he replied, "I am waiting for a question." He continued, "You said I lack qualifications, which is interesting." AOC cut in sharply, "I didn't say it was interesting. I said it was unacceptable." Bongino sat forward slightly, saying, "So, let me clarify, just so the record is correct." The room seemed to lean in with him as he listed 4 years NYPD East New York, where gunfire was basically part of the scenery. He continued, 12 years Secret Service, Presidents Bush and Obama, overseas deployments, financial crimes, counterfeiting, and fraud protection details you probably couldn't list because they remain classified. Murmurs rippled through the rows behind her, and AOC's expression flickered with uncertainty. Bongino added quietly, "So if a former bartender with a large Twitter following wants to question my qualifications, I would at least hope she knows what qualifications look like." The stunned silence descended like a heavy curtain, and for the first time that morning, AOC felt the room turn, not toward her, but away. The silence following Bongino's remark hung in the air like a held breath. AOC opened her mouth, closed it, then forced a thin smile, saying, "Cute line. Did you workshop that with your podcast audience?" Bongino didn't answer. Instead, he did something that unsettled even the people who had walked in rooting for her. He smiled, not a taunt or a smirk, but a quiet, composed expression, suggesting he had already read ahead in the script and knew exactly how the next scene would unfold. AOC stammered, asking, You are smiling?" Trying to stay polite, Bongino replied, "You accused me of being unqualified, and I gave you my qualifications. Is that okay?" A committee member cleared his throat, instructing, "Let's maintain decorum." AOC shot back, "I am maintaining decorum," to which Bongino responded softly, "You are maintaining volume." Several reporters exchanged startled glances, with one whispering, "He is not rattled." Another scribbled quickly, noting, "Power, dynamic shifting." AOC leaned closer to the mic, stating, "Your demeanor right now is exactly what concerns me. You think this is a joke, No, Bongino said. I think this is predictable. He tapped the folder gently, adding, You came ready to perform. I came ready to answer. AOC's aide shifted behind her, murmuring, She is losing the frame. She heard him, and her shoulders stiffened as she repeated, Predictable. Explain that. You walk in with talking points, Bongino said. Hit your rehearsed lines, hope I get flustered, and hope your clips trend. He shrugged, adding, It is a strategy, just not a very good one. The room erupted in low murmurs. Someone's pen dropped, and cameras refocused. AOC's voice sharpened as she accused, You are mocking the oversight process. No, he replied, I am respecting it, which is why I am here with actual information. His hand rested on the folder again, deliberate and steady, as he added, Not slogans. AOC stared at the folder and asked, What is that, exactly? You will see. The words were soft, almost gentle, yet they landed like a threat wrapped in courtesy. A Republican member leaned back, whispering, Here it comes. A Democrat whispered back, She needs to regain control fast. AOC inhaled and spoke carefully this time, saying, Mr. Bongino, if you think holding a mysterious folder is going to intimidate anyone on this committee— Intimidate? Bongino interrupted, shaking his head. No, the truth doesn't intimidate, he said. It just waits patiently. AOC blinked, asking, What does that mean? Bongino finally leaned forward, the smile remaining, but his tone deepening. It means the moment you stop performing, we can start the hearing. The room fell completely still, cameras capturing every flicker of AOC's expression. For the first time, her confidence faltered, and that quiet, controlled, unshakable smile became the moment the entire hearing pivoted. The chair adjusted his glasses, stating, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, please continue. AOC cleared her throat, replying, Gladly, as she straightened her papers with extra force. Mr. Bongino, since you are eager to lecture us on performing, let's revisit your, how did you put it, qualifications. Bongino nodded, saying, Go ahead. She leaned forward, accusing, You have made a career out of partisan commentary and repeatedly attacked members of this very committee. How does that align with impartial federal service? Bongino tilted his head, asking, Are you asking a question this time, or is this another audition? A ripple of reaction moved across the room, and AOC's eyes narrowed as she demanded, Answer it. I will, Bongino replied, but let's clean something up first. He tapped the folder, noting, You opened with accusations, lots of them, none supported by evidence. That is unusual for an oversight hearing. That is rich, she shot back. A man with your record preaching about evidence. Oh, my record is fine, he said calmly. Your understanding of it is the problem. AOC bristled, saying, Excuse me? Bongino folded his hands, explaining, You claimed I was unqualified, but you left out the parts that don't fit your script. He turned slightly toward the committee, remarking, She does that a lot. A Democrat whispered, He is flipping the frame on her. A Republican replied, He already flipped it. AOC forced a tight smile, saying, Since you are so concerned with my script, perhaps you would like to enlighten the committee about what you think my motives are. Motives? Bongino asked. You walked in ready to embarrass me. That is obvious. He paused, adding, But here is the twist. You forgot to bring facts, just lines. AOC's nostrils flared as she retorted, My lines are rooted in your own statements and actions. Which ones? Bongino asked. She blinked, answering, All of them. That is not an answer, he countered. It is sufficient, she insisted. No, he said quietly. It isn't. A few cameras zoomed in, catching the moment AOC's composure slipped. Bongino continued, "Let's quote you, since you like rhetoric. You said publicly that my service was decorative, that I hid behind titles, that I was dangerous." "I stand by those characterizations," she asserted. "Good," he said, "because I brought them with me." He tapped the folder again, saying, "Along with the receipts, you didn't expect anyone to check." Reporters leaned forward as if pulled by a magnet. AOC swallowed, asking, "What receipts?" "The ones that make your opening statement," Bongino said, "look very different once the truth is added." Her voice thinned as she accused, "You are deflecting." "No," Bongino replied, eyes locking onto hers. "I am correcting." A hush fell over the hearing. For the first time, the committee wasn't watching AOC perform. They were watching her react. And that was the turn. Subtle, devastating, and irreversible. The chair leaned forward, asking, "Mr. Bongino, if you have information relevant to the committee." "Oh, I do," Bongino said, sliding the thin folder closer. "And since Representative Ocasio-Cortez wants to discuss qualifications and integrity, we should probably examine both." AOC straightened, saying, "If you think waving around props—" "This isn't a prop," he interrupted. He opened the folder, the sound soft, but the room reacted as if a vault door had swung open. AOC's aide whispered sharply behind her, "What is that? Did we know about this?" She didn't answer. Bongino lifted a single page, asking, "Representative, are you familiar with this entity?" He read the name of a shell company aloud. AOC blinked, stating, "I am not answering vague insinuations." "It is not vague," Bongino replied. "It is a company your chief of staff registered, or attempted to." He tapped the document, adding, "It doesn't exist at the listed address." A reporter whispered, "What the hell is this?" Another replied, "He brought documentation." She wasn't expecting documentation. Bongino continued, "Through this non-existent company, approximately $85,000 flowed unreported to your romantic partner." AOC's voice shot up half a pitch, declaring, "That is categorically false." "Excellent," Bongino said. "Show me the documents proving it." AOC froze. Bongino waited 10 seconds, then 15. "You claim to care about transparency," he added, "so here is your chance." AOC finally exhaled sharply, stating, "I am not required to respond to fabricated accusations." "Fabricated?" Bongino asked, lifting a second page. "These aren't my documents. They are from FEC records." He slid the sheet forward, saying, "Reviewed, logged, time-stamped." The Democrats behind her fell still. AOC's voice quivered with controlled anger as she said, "You are twisting data." Representative Bongino said quietly, "If I were twisting it, you would be able to untwist it. You would have an answer." She faltered, beginning, My counsel can—" "No," Bongino interrupted. "This is your hearing. These are your filings. These are your numbers." AOC's aide whispered, barely audible, "This isn't in our prep. We don't have responses to this." Bongino added, "And that is just the first company. Shall we continue?" He lifted another sheet, another irregularity, another missing document, another transfer that led nowhere and everywhere at once. AOC's breathing thickened as she accused, "You are misrepresenting my campaign." "Then correct me," he said. "Now would be the moment." She said nothing, and the committee room felt smaller, as though the oxygen had thinned, while reporters scribbled like court stenographers capturing a confession. Bongino closed the folder slowly, deliberately, and said, "That was the warm-up." AOC's hands shook almost imperceptibly. Her performance had stopped, and his dismantling had just begun. Bongino rested his hand on the now closed folder, letting the silence settle around it like dust after an explosion. Then he lifted his eyes, saying, "Representative, the money trail is just one piece, but your rhetoric, that is the part that deserves daylight." AOC stiffened, retorting, "My rhetoric is not on trial here. Everything is on trial when you enter this room." His tone didn't rise. If anything, it grew quieter, which somehow made it sharper. "Let's start with housing," he proposed. AOC blinked, repeating, "Housing?" "Yes," Bongino said, opening the folder again and sliding out a glossy photo. "Your residence," he noted, "luxury complex, infinity pool, Steinway piano in the lobby, courtesy massage suites, golf simulator." AOC's eyes tightened as she asked, "What is the relevance?" "You have demanded affordable housing mandates for your district," Bongino said, "yet you opted out when your own building offered it." AOC's aide whispered behind her, "We should move this off camera." But Bongino continued, "How do you reconcile that with your public statements about inequality?" AOC snapped, "I am allowed to live where I choose." "Of course," he agreed. "You are just not allowed to lecture people on affordability while you swim past an infinity pool paid for by the same constituents you claim to defend." Reporters leaned closer, pens scratching relentlessly. AOC shot back, "This is shameless character assassination." "Character?" Bongino asked. "No, patterns." He pulled a second printed image from the folder, saying, "Here is another pattern. The Met Gala, the white dress, red letters. Tax the rich." AOC's face reddened instantly as she stated, "I am not going to entertain cheap shots about symbolism." "It wasn't symbolism," Bongino said. "It was hypocrisy. You wore a designer gown to an event where a table cost more than some families earn in a year." He paused, adding, "But you already know that." AOC barked, "I was invited. I didn't pay." "That is the problem," Bongino cut in. "Who paid? Why? What did they expect in return?" He waited, but still there were no answers. A Democrat 2 seats down exhaled heavily, muttering, "This is bad." His colleague whispered, "She needs to pivot now." AOC straightened, accusing, "You are intentionally distorting my activism." "You keep using that word," Bongino replied, "yet every example you give of activism seems to benefit you first." He leaned forward, asking, "Shall we talk about Amazon?" AOC froze, stating, "We are not discussing Amazon." "We are," Bongino said, "because what happened in Queens wasn't activism. It was destruction." AOC's lips trembled at the edges as she insisted, "I protected my district." "You cost it 25,000 jobs," he said, "and we are going to talk about that next." The hearing room shifted again. Chairs creaked, cameras refocused, and tension coiled tight as wire. AOC wasn't just losing control, she was losing the room. Bongino lifted a new set of documents from the folder, thinner than the financial records but heavier in consequence. He held them between two fingers as if weighing the cost they represented, saying, "Let's talk about Amazon." AOC stiffened instantly, asserting, "This committee is not here to litigate a corporate deal." "No," Bongino replied, "but we are here to evaluate judgment, and yours cost your district 25,000 jobs." A murmur rippled through the room, and one reporter mouthed, "He is going for the jugular." AOC fired back, "I prevented a billion-dollar corporation from exploiting working people." "You prevented thousands of working people from having jobs," Bongino said. He unfolded the first page, stating, Here is the projection from the economic impact report you ignored. AOC's eyes darted toward her aide, who whispered, "We don't have counter data. Stick to messaging." She inhaled sharply and said, "Economic projections are not guarantees." "No," Bongino said, "but math usually beats slogans." He read aloud, 25,000 direct jobs, tens of thousands of secondary jobs, billions in economic activity, gone. AOC retorted, "We saved the community from gentrification and displacement." "You celebrated," Bongino replied, "on camera, remember?" He mimicked her earlier words with frightening accuracy, saying, "We defeated Amazon." AOC's jaw clenched as she insisted, "Those comments were taken out of context." "Okay," Bongino said, "let's add context." He slid another sheet forward, noting, "Here are the current numbers. Virginia, where Amazon did build, received 94% of the projected jobs. New York received 6. The room went dead quiet. A Democratic member whispered, "Defeated 6%. A Republican whispered back, "She walked into this one." AOC tried to regain footing, arguing, "Economic development is complex. It is about lost opportunity," Bongino said. "People in your district needed work. Instead, they got you on a stage declaring victory while businesses boarded up windows." He leaned in, asking, "Do you know how many residents filed for unemployment in the quarters following the collapse?" AOC glared, answering, "I don't keep those numbers memorized." "I do," his voice dropped, "because someone needed to." He flipped the page, stating, "A 43% spike." AOC felt heat rising across her cheeks, demanding, "That is misleading." "Is it?" Bongino asked, "because the economists who produced this study aren't known for partisan theatrics." AOC tried again, saying, "I acted in the best interest of my community." "No," Bongino said quietly, "you acted in the best interest of a narrative, and narratives don't employ people." A staffer in the back muttered, "She is losing ground fast." Another said, "She is losing the room completely." Bongino set the papers down, adding, "And Representative, this isn't even the worst of it." AOC's lips parted, but no words came. "The worst," Bongino said, "is what you compared to a concentration camp." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. A chill moved through the hearing room as Bongino spoke the name Auschwitz. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, for the mere sound of it seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. AOC shifted in her chair, stating, "We are not going to engage in inflammatory—" "You made the comparison," Bongino said. "Not me." She froze. Bongino gently opened the folder again and removed a single sheet of paper, not a document this time, but a printed screenshot. Her own words, bold text, "Never again means never again," Bongino noted. AOC whispered, "This is taken." "These are your words." "You posted them publicly," Bongino repeated. "You invoked the phrase that my wife's grandmother carried carved into her mind for the rest of her life." The room fell silent. True, heavy silence, not political tension, but human tension. AOC swallowed, explaining, "I was referring to humanitarian conditions." "That you compared detention centers," Bongino said softly, "to the camp where her grandmother watched her sister die." A reporter lowered his pen, and another looked down at the floor, suddenly embarrassed to bear witness. AOC tried again, urging, "The intent. My intent was to spotlight suffering." "No," Bongino said. "Your intent was to amplify outrage. You used a historical atrocity as a political prop." He leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper, asking, "Do you know what starvation looks like?" Do you know what frostbite on bone looks like? Do you know what it means to survive because someone else didn't? AOC's eyes glistened as she insisted, I wasn't minimizing, you were trivializing. His tone didn't rise. It softened even more. Because the moment you invoked Auschwitz, Representative, you made every real survivor's suffering part of your brand strategy. She blinked hard, fighting the sting. Bongino continued, My wife's grandmother weighed 79 pounds when the camp was liberated. She hadn't stood on her own feet for 2 months. Her hands were so damaged, she couldn't hold a pen. He tapped the desk, saying, And you compared that to climate-controlled facilities with medical care and meals. AOC whispered, I didn't mean... You didn't know, he corrected gently, and you didn't care to learn. A hit of breath escaped her, half sob, half denial, as she stared at the desk, her shoulders trembling. Behind her, a Democratic colleague murmured, This is bad. Another whispered, She is breaking. Bongino placed the screenshot down slowly, as if laying a flower at a grave, and said, You invoked a genocide you never studied for a point. You never supported with facts. He paused, concluding, And for the first time today, I think you realize what you have done. AOC covered her mouth with her hand, as the tears finally slipped. The room didn't breathe, and for the first time, she couldn't speak. The room stayed frozen long after AOC's tears began to fall. Even the cameras, usually hungry for motion, seemed to hesitate before recording the moment. Bongino didn't move. He didn't press. He simply allowed the quiet to widen around her, until it felt like the whole committee was leaning over an emotional cliff. Finally, the chair whispered, Representative, you may respond if... AOC lifted her hand weakly. Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard, beginning, I need... But Bongino spoke first. No, he said gently, you don't need anything. You need answers. He tapped the folder once, stating, And we are still not done. AOC's breath hitched as she pleaded, Please, this is not appropriate. What is inappropriate, Bongino replied, is misrepresenting facts. He removed another sheet from the folder, saying, Let's clear up a few more. Her aide whispered urgently behind her, We should request a recess. But Bongino continued, You have made numerous economic claims, false ones. You cited studies that don't exist, and you referenced data your own staff admitted was fabricated. He slid the papers toward her, saying, We checked. AOC pressed her trembling fingers to her temple, stating, I didn't knowingly... Bongino cut in, still controlled, noting, Your chief of staff admitted publicly that the Green New Deal wasn't a climate bill. He read aloud, It was a restructuring of the American economy. His words, not mine. AOC's eyes widened in horror, and she protested, That statement was taken out of context. Bongino finished, Seems like you rely on that word a lot today. A few members shifted uncomfortably, and reporters exchanged glances that said, This is history. Record everything. Bongino placed the final sheet on the table and closed the folder with deliberate calm. We have gone through qualifications, finances, housing, hypocrisy, jobs, history, policy, and integrity, he listed. He lifted his gaze, saying, And now we are at the end. AOC looked defeated, eyes wet, shoulders slumped, her earlier confidence scattered across the room like broken glass. Bongino leaned forward slightly, voice soft but razor-sharp, asking, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, a pause so long the air went taut. Do you have anything to say? The question landed like a gavel dropped from the ceiling. AOC opened her mouth, but no sound came out. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30. The only noise in the entire room was the faint mechanical whir of cameras zooming in to capture her silence. An unplanned, undeniable confession. She lowered her head, and a single tear fell onto the microphone. Bongino exhaled once, almost sympathetically, saying, "I didn't think so." The room erupted not in noise, but in the stunned, breathless realization that something irreversible had just happened. The hearing adjourned, but no one moved at first. Reporters sat, stunned, fingers hovering over keyboards, while staffers stared at one another, waiting for someone to declare what they had just witnessed. AOC rose slowly from her chair, and her aide whispered, "We need to get you out now." But the cameras were already closing in, lenses tracking her like predators scenting weakened prey. As she stepped back from the desk, a reporter called out, "Representative, do you have a statement regarding Mr. Bongino's disclosures?" Another shouted, "Will there be an internal review?" AOC didn't answer. She pushed past her aide, who kept repeating, no comments, at this time. Across the room, Bongino gathered his papers with the same steady movements he'd had at the start. Calm, clinical, almost detached. A Republican member approached him, whispering, "Jesus, Dan, you just rewrote the midterms." Bongino shrugged, replying, "Truth does most of the work." A Democrat hurried past, muttering into his phone, "We need a unified response before this spins out. No, before it detonates." A senior staffer followed him, saying, "Damage control won't hold, not after that." Another staffer whispered, "She is in real trouble, serious trouble." Outside the chamber, the hallway exploded into a hive of noise, with reporters shouting questions and camera lights strobing against marble walls. AOC blinked rapidly as she tried to force her expression neutral, whispering, "What is our statement?" Her aide hesitated, stammering, We don't have one yet." "Then write one," she snapped, voice cracking. "Fix this." But the aide didn't move. His silence told her the truth. This wasn't something a statement could fix. Farther down the hall, two journalists shared a quick exchange, one remarking, "That was career-ending." The other replied, "You think she survives this? Ethics is already drafting inquiries. They have to." At that moment, a Senate staffer stepped out of a side room and murmured to a colleague, "Phones are blowing up. Donors are withdrawing. She is toxic now." Back inside the hearing room, Bongino closed the folder that had shifted the axis of the entire chamber, and handed it to a clerk. "Make sure this gets entered into the record," he said. The clerk nodded, saying, "People will be talking about today for a long time." "They should," Bongino replied. "It is what happens when the performance meets the truth." As he walked out, a reporter asked him, "Did you expect this outcome?" Bongino paused only once, replying, "I expected the facts to speak. They usually do." AOC watched him leave from the far end of the hallway, surrounded by cameras, her breathing uneven. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Her aide finally gave the answer no one wanted to say aloud. "We brace for the investigations." And just like that, Washington began to move, quietly, ruthlessly, circling the wounded. The hearing was over, but the fallout had only begun. The marble corridors of the Rayburn Building, usually a place of hushed deals and brisk walks, transformed instantly into a gauntlet of flashing strobes and shouting voices that echoed off the high ceilings. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez moved through the crush of bodies with her head down, a stark departure from the chin-up defiance she had projected only an hour prior, while her security detail aggressively cleared a path through the wall of reporters. Questions were thrown like stones, asking about the ethics violations, the shell companies, and the specific fabrication of data regarding her district's economic collapse. But she refused to acknowledge a single one. Her aide, breathless and pale, held a phone to his ear with a trembling hand, whispering, "I can't hold them off," to someone on the other end of the line. They finally reached the heavy oak doors of the elevator, and as the metal grate slid shut, it severed the connection between the representative and the press, leaving only the ringing silence of a career in free fall. Inside the frantic sanctuary of the waiting SUV, the silence was worse than the noise outside because it was filled with the sudden, crushing realization of what had just been lost. AOC slumped against the leather seat, her eyes fixed on the tint of the window, watching the blur of Washington pass by as her phone lit up with a relentless cascade of notifications she was too afraid to check. "The DNC chair is on line 1, her aide said from the front seat, his voice barely a whisper, "and the donor committee for the re-election fund is on line 2. She closed her eyes, ignoring both, knowing that neither call was to offer support. They were calling to assess the blast radius. "Tell them I am in transit," she said, her voice sounding hollow and unrecognizable even to herself. "Tell them we are formulating a response." The aide looked back at her in the rearview mirror, his expression grim, and replied, "Representative, they aren't asking for a response. They are asking for your resignation from the committee." While panic consumed the motorcade speeding away from Capitol Hill, Dan Bongino exited the building not like a victor of a gladiatorial bout, but like a workman who had finished a particularly difficult shift. He stopped briefly at the security checkpoint to shake the hand of a Capitol police officer, a quiet gesture of mutual respect that went unnoticed by the lingering cameras trained on the distant elevators. A producer from a major cable network tried to intercept him near the steps, shoving a microphone toward his face and asking, "Mr. Bongino, do you believe the committee will vote to expel her based on these findings?" Bongino didn't break his stride, merely adjusting his collar against the evening chill. "The committee will do what the committee does," he replied evenly, "but the American people now have the receipts, and that is a verdict she cannot appeal." He stepped into the waiting car, the folder of evidence now resting on the seat beside him. Its job done, its contents already burning across the internet at the speed of light. By the time the sun began to dip behind the monuments, the digital landscape had shifted violently, with the clips of the hearing accumulating millions of views in a matter of hours. It wasn't just conservative outlets sharing the exchange. Independent journalists, financial analysts, and even former supporters were dissecting the specific, undeniable data points Bongino had laid out. The image of AOC staring silently at the desk, unable to answer the question about the shell company, became the defining thumbnail of the day. A visual epitaph for a reputation built on verbal agility. The narrative didn't just crack, one prominent political commentator wrote on Twitter. It evaporated under the heat of actual forensic auditing. In the strategy rooms of the opposition party, the mood had swung from defensive caution to aggressive opportunity, with senior strategists already drafting campaign ads that simply played the hearing footage without any voiceover. Later that night, in a dimly lit office in Northern Virginia, Bongino sat with a small circle of his team, the television on mute in the background flashing images of the day's upheaval. There was no champagne, no celebration, just the quiet satisfaction of a mission executed with surgical precision. "They are saying this is the end of her national ambitions," a staffer noted, scrolling through a tablet loaded with polling data that showed a vertical drop in her favorability. Bongino took a sip of water and looked at the screen, where a pundit was gesturing wildly at a graphic of the Amazon job losses. "It isn't about her ambition," he said softly. "It is about the illusion that performance can replace competence." He leaned back, the fatigue finally showing in his eyes, and added, We didn't end her career today. We just turned on the lights, and she couldn't survive the glare. Across town, the atmosphere in AOC's apartment was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and the palpable tension of a team watching a ship sink. She sat on the edge of her sofa, still wearing the suit from the hearing, watching the news cycle through her humiliation on a loop that felt endless. "We can pivot to a victim narrative," her communications director suggested desperately. "Claim the data was obtained illegally. Claim it is a targeted harassment campaign." AOC looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. "Bongino cited public FEC records," she whispered. "He cited my own tweets. He cited the economic impact reports we signed off on." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at a city that suddenly felt hostile and foreign. "There is no spin for this," she said, her voice trembling with finality. "You can't spin math, and you can't spin silence." The fallout continued to spiral downward the following morning, as the Department of Justice announced a preliminary inquiry into the campaign finance irregularities exposed during the testimony. The announcement was brief, clinical, and devastating, stripping away the last layer of political protection she had hoped might shield her from legal consequences. Major donors began to issue statements distancing themselves, using phrases like "troubling allegations" and "awaiting clarity" to sever ties without explicitly admitting they had funded the debacle. The squad, usually a phalanx of unified defense, remained conspicuously silent, their social media feeds dormant as self-preservation instincts overrode loyalty. It was the brutal calculus of Washington in motion. When a star turns toxic, the galaxy expands to leave them alone in the dark. Dan Bongino watched the press conference from his home studio, the morning light catching the edge of the microphone he used to reach millions of listeners who had waited for this vindication. He didn't gloat on air. Instead, he used the moment to deliver a monologue on the fragility of power built on deception. "They told you they were untouchable," he said into the mic, his voice resonating with the authority of someone who had just proven otherwise. "They told you that feelings mattered more than facts, that intentions outweighed results." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy for effect. "But yesterday proved that when you strip away the lights, the cameras, and the applause, the truth is the only thing left standing in the room." As the week wore on, the inevitability of the situation settled over the Capitol like a heavy winter fog, obscuring the future of a once bright political comet. Resignation rumors began to swirl, first as whispers in the cloakroom, then as chyrons on the bottom of news broadcasts. AOC canceled all public appearances, retreating into a bunker of legal counsel and crisis management, effectively vanishing from the stage she had dominated for years. The hearing room where it all happened sat empty now, but the ghost of that encounter lingered, a warning to anyone who believed that rhetoric could indefinitely outrun reality. The folder Bongino had left behind was now part of the permanent congressional record, a thin, unmarked volume that weighed more than 1,000 speeches. In the end, the implosion wasn't marked by a loud explosion or a dramatic speech, but by the quiet, administrative dismantling of a career that had flown too close to the sun on wings of wax. The lasting image wasn't of Bongino shouting, but of him waiting, patient, prepared, and lethal in his calmness. He had proven that the most dangerous weapon in a political fight wasn't volume, but verification. As history turned the page on the era of performative governance, the lesson etched into the marble of D.C. was clear. You can act the part of a leader for only so long before someone walks into the room, places a folder on the table, and asks the one question you never thought you'd have to answer. Is it true? The summons to the Speaker's private office arrived not as an invitation, but as a directive, delivered by a grim-faced page who refused to make eye contact. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked the long carpeted path to the leadership suite alone, her footsteps muffled by the heavy wool, acutely aware that her staff had been quietly updating their LinkedIn profiles since dawn. Inside the room, the air was frigid, and the reception was devoid of the usual pleasantries that grease the wheels of Capitol Hill. The party leadership didn't offer her a seat. They simply laid out a new set of polling numbers on the mahogany desk, data that showed her district was no longer a stronghold, but a battleground. "You have become a liability," the senior whip said, his voice dry and devoid of sympathy, "and we cannot afford to lose a seat in New York because you couldn't balance a ledger." She tried to argue, to invoke her grassroots army and her social media reach, but the speaker cut her off with a wave of a hand. "Twitter is not the electorate," the speaker said coldly, "and likes do not pay legal fees." The ultimatum was clear: resign with a shred of dignity citing personal reasons, or face a humiliating ethics vote that the party would not whip against. AOC left the office feeling lighter, but not in the way she had hoped. It was the weightlessness of an astronaut whose tether had been cut, drifting into a void. Back in her office, the phone lines had been unplugged to stop the incessant ringing, and the piles of mail were now being screened by Capitol Police for threats. She looked at the framed magazine covers on her wall, images of her captured in heroic poses, realizing they were artifacts of a timeline that had just been erased. Her chief of staff, the man whose financial maneuvering had triggered the avalanche, sat with his head in his hands, knowing his own legal nightmare was only beginning. "Draft the statement," she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "Make it about health. Make it about family. Make it about anything but the truth." The press conference was scheduled for the Rose Garden of the Capitol, a setting usually reserved for legislative victories, now repurposed for a political funeral. The press corps gathered with a predatory energy, sensing the finality of the moment, their cameras trained on the podium like rifles. When she emerged, she looked smaller than she ever had on screen. The fiery defiance replaced by a practiced, brittle somberness. She spoke of relentless pressure and the need to focus on personal well-being, weaving a narrative of victimhood that might have worked a week ago. But as she spoke, the reporters weren't taking notes on her words. They were checking the facts against the contents of Bongino's folder. When she finished and turned to leave without taking questions, a single shout rang out from the back. "Representative, are you cooperating with the FBI?" She didn't flinch, didn't turn back, and simply disappeared behind the heavy doors, leaving the question hanging in the autumn air like smoke. Dan Bongino didn't watch the resignation live. He was in the middle of a segment breaking down the intricacies of the shell company transfers for his audience. When the producer flashed the "She's Out" graphic on the monitor, he didn't cheer, and he didn't pause the show. He simply looked into the camera lens, the same way he had looked at her across the witness table, and addressed the audience with a calm intensity. "She resigned because the math didn't add up," he said. "Not because the pressure was too hard, but because the evidence was too heavy." He picked up the replica of the folder he kept on his desk, tapping it once for emphasis. "Remember this moment," he told his listeners. "It is the moment we stopped accepting the performance and started demanding the receipts." In the weeks that followed, the ecosystem of Washington underwent a subtle but profound recalibration. Committee hearings became noticeably more substantive, with members on both sides of the aisle glancing nervously at the witness tables, checking to see if anyone had brought a folder. The era of the clapback clip began to fade, replaced by a newfound fear of forensic scrutiny. as the lesson of AOC's fall reverberated through the halls of power. The investigations into her finances continued, grinding forward with the slow, impartial turning of the gears of justice, ensuring that while she was gone from the screen, she would not be forgotten by the courts. Dan Bongino returned to his work, the quiet architect of a revolution in oversight, having proved that one man, armed with the truth and the courage to present it, could dismantle a machine built on noise. And in the archives of Congress, buried among millions of pages of testimony, that thin, unmarked folder remained, a silent testament to the day the music stopped.